I almost missed the turnoff. The sign for Holcomb Road was nailed to a fence post about 3 miles north of Rochester, hand-painted in faded black letters on a piece of barnwood. If I hadn't been going slow on account of the ice forming along Route 100's shoulders, I would have sailed right past it. I pulled my truck onto a dirt road that climbed immediately uphill, winding through a corridor of bare maple trees, their branches lacing together overhead like fingers. It was just past 4 in the afternoon and the sky was already the color of a bruise. I had booked the Holcomb farmhouse 2 weeks earlier, sometime around midnight when the article I was supposed to be writing had stalled completely. The piece was about Vermont's vanishing hill farms, the ones you saw driving north of Randolph or up toward Granville, buildings slowly collapsing into their foundations, cellar holes filling with decades of leaves, stone walls running through second-growth forest where nobody had farmed in 60 years. I had 300 draft words and a folder full of notes that didn't want to connect. I needed to be out in it, walking the same ground I was writing about, breathing the same November air. The Airbnb listing had come up when I searched for remote farmhouses near Rochester. Old farmhouse, circa 1847. Wood stove, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. A few reviews calling it peaceful and authentic. The photos showed a white clapboard house at the end of a long field, the green mountains dark behind it. I booked 2 nights without thinking too hard about it. I'd stayed in worse places for a story. The road climbed for nearly a mile before the tree line broke and the farmhouse came into view. It sat on a slight rise, a 2-story rectangle that had been white once and was now the color of old bone. The barn off to the left had lost most of its roof. What remained sagged inward, the ridgeline bowed into a kind of frown. The field between the road and the house was grown over with goldenrod and milkweed gone to seed, pale and dry in the November cold. A stone wall ran along the field's eastern edge, the granite dark with old lichen, built by someone who was dead before my grandfather was born. I parked in the gravel pull-off and got out. The cold hit me right away. Not just cold, but the specific kind of Vermont November cold that doesn't have any give to it. The air smelled of wood smoke, faint, like it had been there and faded rather than something currently burning. There was something underneath that smell too, something dry and herbal. I noticed it more strongly when I stepped onto the porch. Lavender maybe, or something older than lavender. The owner had left the key in a small lockbox mounted to the porch railing. The welcome note said the guest book was on the mantel, and I should sign in when I arrived. The wood stove in the living room had been stocked for the night. The kitchen had basics, coffee, canned goods, bread, everything routine. I let myself in. The entryway was narrow. Hooks for coats along one wall, a braided rug underfoot, a steep staircase to the right. The living room opened ahead of me. Low ceilings, beadboard walls painted a cream color that had yellowed to something warmer. Wide pine floors, worn smooth in the paths people had walked most often. From the door to the stove, from the stove to the kitchen, from the kitchen back to the stairs, a wood stove in the corner, a fire already laid and waiting to be lit. On the mantel above the hearth, a kerosene hurricane lamp, a framed photograph, and the guest book. I set my bag down at the bottom of the stairs and crossed to the mantel. The photograph caught my attention first. It was an old one, printed on heavy paper and mounted in a plain wooden frame. A young woman in a dark dress, her hair pulled back tightly, her face turned slightly to one side. She looked somewhere between 20 and 25. Below the photograph, a handwritten label on yellowed cardstock read, Patience Holcomb, 1869. She had dark eyes and a tight, unsmiling mouth, the way people in old photographs never smiled because the exposure took so long you had to hold perfectly still. She looked like she was in the middle of thinking about something she didn't want to think about. I picked up the guest book. It was heavier than I expected. Maybe 300 pages bound in dark green cloth, no title on the cover. The pages were cream-colored, slightly rough to the touch. I opened it to the welcome note on the inside front cover. check-in instructions, a note about the wood stove, a reminder to sign the book when departing. Standard language. I started flipping through the entries from the beginning. They were mostly what you'd expect. Couples, a few solo travelers, one family. Things like magical place, needed the quiet, and best sleep in years. The handwriting changed from entry to entry, some cramped and slanted, some looping, a few printed in careful block letters. People dated their stays, noted where they'd come from. A woman from Burlington wrote about a fox she'd seen at the field's edge at dawn. A man from New Hampshire sketched the mountains as seen from the back porch. The entries had the easy, unhurried quality of people who had come here to slow down and actually managed to do it. I found Marcus Webb's entry near the back of the filled portion. It was dated 3 days earlier, which would have put him here last Wednesday. The handwriting was rushed, slanting downward across the page, the letters crowded together like the writer had been in a hurry or standing up without a solid surface under the book. Beautiful property, historic and atmospheric. Spent first night well. Second afternoon, I heard movement coming from the basement. Rhythmic, like footsteps or something being dragged. I went to investigate and found something I should not have seen. I am leaving a day early. I would not recommend this property to anyone. Do not stay here past the first night. Do not go into the basement under any circumstances. Monsieur Webb. I read it twice. The note was strange, but not exactly alarming, not on its own. People heard things in old houses. Rafters contracted in the cold, animals got into basements, pipes knocked, and some guests scared themselves in quiet places. You heard every small sound when there was nothing else to listen to. I turned the page. The handwriting changed. The date at the top of the entry was 3 weeks from now. I looked at it for a moment, thinking I had misread it. I hadn't. The month and year were written clearly, in a handwriting that was neat and upright, nothing like Webb's rushed scrawl. A woman named Jennifer Park had written about coming to look for Marcus Webb, who she described as a friend and fellow journalist who had stopped responding after his stay at Holcomb House. Her entry was long, 6 dense paragraphs, and described arriving in the afternoon, finding the guest book, reading Webb's note. The later paragraphs described noises from the basement and a smell she couldn't identify, and then the writing changed quality partway through, became less organized, less like a journal entry, and more like notes scrawled in the dark. I stood there with the book open in my hands. My first thought was that it was staged, a prop, something the owner had set up for atmosphere. Some Airbnb properties did themed experiences, but I'd read enough fabricated documents in my career to know what they felt like. Too clean, too consistent, everything pointing the right direction. This was different. Jennifer Park's handwriting was genuinely different from Marcus Webb's. Different grip, different slant, different pressure on the page, different person. I turned another page, and another. The dates kept moving forward. A man named Darren Cole had come in January to look for Jennifer Park. After him, 2 more in February, their entries overlapping, each one mentioning the people who had come before. Each new entry was in a different hand, as though produced by separate people at separate times. Each one described sounds from the basement. None of them described leaving. I kept turning. The entries filled the book nearly to its end. The last filled entry was dated March 2025, written in a clipped, formal hand identifying itself only as a Vermont state official. Property condemned pending investigation. 17 individuals reported missing in connection with this address since November 2024. Investigation ongoing. This property is closed to visitors. 17. I closed the book. My hands were steady. I noticed that specifically the steadiness, because it surprised me. I was standing in a farmhouse with a book that appeared to contain a sequence of future deaths stretching out from this exact moment, and my hands were steady. 15 years of investigative journalism did that. I'd stood in contaminated fields while farmers told me their kids were sick. I'd listened to things that were terrible. You learned to stay level because the moment you lost it, you stopped being able to do your job. I turned the book over in my hands and noticed something. The spine was thicker than it should have been for the page count. I ran my thumb along the inside of the back cover and felt a folded piece of paper tucked flat into the binding. I unfolded it. Rules for guests of Holcomb House. Please read before nightfall. 6 rules, handwritten in a tight, careful cursive. Old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship nobody learned anymore. The first said not to write in the guest book until my final morning. Sign only when leaving, never before. The second said that if I heard movement from the basement between dusk and dawn, I should not investigate. I should light the hurricane lamp on the mantel and keep it burning until sunrise. The third mentioned the photograph. If the eyes of the woman pictured appeared closed, I should leave immediately. I should not return for my belongings. The fourth said that between 2 and 3 in the morning, I might hear someone calling my name from outside. I should not answer. I should not look through the windows. The voice knows things about you that no stranger should know. The 5th rule stopped me cold. If you find writing in the guest book dated after your arrival, do not read past your own date. Close the book. Burn sage from the kitchen drawer. The future is not meant to be witnessed. I had already read past my own date. I had read every entry, all the way to March 2025. Every name. Every description of footsteps and basement smells and things seen that shouldn't have been seen. I had read all of it before I'd found the rules that told me not to. The 6th rule. Should you break any rule, write your transgression on the final page of the guest book before midnight. Confession may grant mercy. Silence will not. I checked my phone. No signal. Not even one bar. I walked to the front window. The sky outside had gone fully dark while I had been standing at the mantel reading. The last light was a pale thread along the ridgeline to the west. I could see maybe 30 feet of the front field before the dark swallowed it. The stone wall at the far edge was invisible. The barn was a black shape, nothing more. Sunset had come and gone without me noticing. I turned back toward the room, and that was when I heard it. It came from beneath the floor. Not the creak of a settling beam, not a pipe, not a mouse in the walls. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing from the back of the basement toward the front, each one landing with the flat, solid weight of something that had mass, getting louder step by step, something moving across a floor directly below where I was standing. And then the door at the far end of the living room swung open 6 inches on its own. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't been near it since I came in. It opened and stopped, and behind it, there was nothing but darkness. Not the regular darkness of an unlit room. Something thicker. Something that seemed to press against the opening rather than simply wait inside it. The footsteps stopped. I didn't run. That's the part I still didn't fully understand about myself, even later when I had time to think about it. I backed up, slowly, toward the kitchen doorway, keeping my shoulders square to the open door and the dark behind it. My journalist's brain was already working, cataloging, sorting, looking for an explanation. That instinct was the thing that kept me from braking and going straight back to my truck. The same instinct that had gotten me into this. I looked back at the mantel. The photograph of Patience Holcomb was still in its plain wooden frame. The young woman in the dark dress, face turned slightly to one side, dark eyes aimed at something past the camera, except that wasn't where her eyes were pointed now. She was looking directly at me, not turned toward the lens, not aimed past it. Her gaze was pointed at exactly the spot where I was standing, as clearly as if she had turned her head while I wasn't watching. Her eyes were fully open, and there was nothing I could use to explain it away. I stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway with the guest book pressed to my chest and the basement door open 6 inches in front of me, and I understood 2 things at the same time. The rules were not warnings, and I had already broken one. I stood at the kitchen doorway for a long time after the footsteps stopped. The basement door was still open 6 inches. The darkness behind it hadn't moved. It just sat there pressing against the gap like something solid. I had the irrational feeling that if I looked at it long enough, I'd start to make out shapes in it. I stopped looking at it. The hurricane lamp was on the mantel. Rule 2 said to light it if I heard movement from the basement. I crossed to the mantel, keeping the guest book under my arm, and picked up the lamp. It had oil in it. A box of matches sat beside it. My hands were still steady, but my fingers were clumsier than usual, and I broke the first match before I got it lit. The flame caught, small and orange and steady. I set the lamp back on the mantel and looked at the photograph beside it. Patience. Holcomb's eyes were back where they had started, aimed slightly past the camera, at something off to the left, not looking at me. Whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, wasn't there anymore. I went to the kitchen. The drawer nearest the window was full of the usual rental property miscellany: batteries, a corkscrew, rubber bands, a few takeout menus from restaurants an hour's drive away. The second drawer held a small bundle of dried sage wrapped in kitchen twine. I set it on the counter, found matches on the stove, and lit the end of the bundle. It caught slowly, smoldering more than burning, and put up a thin thread of smoke that smelled bitter and sharp and very old. I held it over the sink and let it smoke. I wasn't doing it because I believed it would help. I was doing it because following the rules felt like the only action available to me. My phone had no signal. The truck was outside, but the night was fully dark and the temperature was dropping, and I'd seen what the ice on Route 100 looked like just getting here. Driving a dirt road in the dark at speed wasn't a good option. Neither was panic. Not until I understood what I was dealing with. I set the bundle in the sink to keep smoldering and picked up the guest book. Rule 6. Write your transgression on the final page before midnight. Confession may grant mercy. I unclipped the pen from my jacket pocket. I opened the guest book to the last blank page and pressed the tip to the paper. Nothing. The pen moved across the page and left no mark. Not a smear, not a faint line, nothing. I pressed harder. Still nothing. I scratched the nib against my palm to confirm there was ink. There was. I tried the page again. The page refused it. I went to my bag and found a pencil. An ordinary wooden pencil, sharpened. I pressed it hard against the final page, hard enough to leave a groove in the paper from pressure alone, if nothing else. No mark. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the closed book. A pen could malfunction. Paper could be treated to resist ink. But a pencil left marks by physically transferring graphite to a surface. You could press a pencil against glass and leave a mark. The fact that this page showed nothing wasn't about the pencil. It was about the page itself. The page wasn't refusing the instrument. It was refusing me specifically. I went to the living room. The bookcase held the expected mix: paperbacks, a Vermont road atlas, tourist brochures. On the bottom shelf, pushed to the back, there was a plain wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox with no label. I pulled it out and set it on the low table near the window. Inside, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, 3 loose photographs, and a small diary bound in cracked brown leather. The photographs were old. One showed the farmhouse exterior looking more or less the same as now, except with a functional barn and a worked field. One was a formal portrait of an older, stern-faced woman I didn't recognize. The third was smaller and slightly blurred. Patience Holcomb, outdoors, one hand raised as though she'd been reaching for something when the shutter was tripped. She didn't look frightened. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. I opened the diary. The handwriting was small and cramped. Brown ink faded unevenly across the pages. The dates started in March 1871. I found a passage in the middle section. Mother's book has taken Elias Crawford. He came wanting to sell the lower pasture back, and I left him alone with the book for an hour while I prepared supper. When I came back, he had written his name in it. He did not understand what he had done. By morning, he was gone. I found his coat at the foot of the basement stairs and nothing else. I turned more pages. I have counted the books on the shelves below, more than last time. I do not understand how they multiply. Mother only explained the rules she wrote to give the guests something to follow while the book worked. She called them fishing lines. I did not understand then. I understand now. And near the end, the handwriting different, faster, less careful. I am going to go into the basement and end it. The book is Mother's making, but I am the last of the bloodline here, and if I sever my own connection, perhaps it will loosen. I cannot keep watching people disappear. Thomas is down there. I think about Thomas every day. 7 years old and bricked into a wall like a timber. Whatever Mother believed she was building, she built it on a child's bones. The final entry was dated November 14th, 1871. I was wrong about the basement. I went down. I found the original ledger behind the wall. I touched it. It was warm, the way a living thing is warm, and the letters moved under my fingers. I tried to write in it, and it took my words, but it also took something else. Something I have no name for. Something I will not have back. I did not sever myself from the binding. The binding took me instead. I can feel it already, the way I can feel the temperature of the room without touching anything, the way I am beginning to see the house from multiple positions at once. I am still here, but I am also... The entry stopped there. Mid-sentence, as though the hand holding the pen had simply ceased. I sat with the diary for a while. The lamp burned steadily. The kitchen still smelled faintly of sage. The basement door was still open 6 inches at the far end of the room. My watch said 8:44 p.m. I was putting the diary back in the box when the basement door moved. Not footsteps this time. A slow creak, the door widening inch by inch the way it opens when someone is pushing it carefully from the other side. The darkness behind it didn't spill out. It just deepened as the gap grew. Then she was there. She came through the doorway and into the living room, and I want to be precise about what I saw because I've tried to describe it several times since, and I always feel like I get it wrong. She was small, shorter than the photographs suggested, thin, wearing a dark dress with a high collar. She looked young, 22 or 23. She looked, for about 3 seconds, like an ordinary person who had walked in from another room. Then she crossed into the lamplight, and I saw her skin. It had the quality of old paper. Not pale, paper. Slightly off-white with a faint grain texture, the way very old pages look when you hold them at an angle to the light. Her veins showed through it, the way text showed through the back of a thin page held up to a window. And her teeth, when she opened her mouth to speak, were covered in tiny handwriting. "You found the diary," she said. Her voice was quiet and flat, like sound from a room away. "Good. It saves time." I didn't answer right away. The handwriting on her teeth was dense and overlapping, written in multiple scripts, and it shifted slightly as she spoke, just enough to notice, the way text shimmers when the surface under it vibrates. "Your patience, Holcomb," I said. "What's left of her?" She moved toward the chair near the window and stood beside it without sitting. Her feet didn't quite make contact with the floor. "You read forward in the book?" "Yes." "How far?" "All the way. 17 people. Property condemned." Something moved across her face. Something that might have been grief worn down to something quieter over a long time. "Then their futures are fixed. Everyone whose name you read will come here. They'll read further, and the people they read will follow. That is how it feeds. You gave it a long chain tonight." I wanted to argue with that, to say that reading words on a page didn't cause events to happen in the real world, but I was in a room with a woman whose skin was the texture of old paper. so I kept quiet and let her talk. She told me about Constance Holcomb, how Constance had come to Vermont from Massachusetts in the 1830s, a widow with children and a box of inherited practices. Cunning work, she called it. Old craft, older than the churches in these hills, passed down through mothers to daughters. Constance bound a ledger to her bloodline and to the land to write small advantages, good weather, healthy livestock, debts that resolved quietly. But the binding fed on the gap between what she wrote and what would have happened without her writing. The larger the gap, the more it needed. And the more it needed, the larger it made the gap. By 1847, Constance sacrificed Thomas, her youngest, 7 years old, and sealed his bones in the basement wall to anchor the binding to the land permanently. She believed this would satisfy it. Instead, it freed the ledger from any remaining restraint. Thomas was meant to be a lock. He became a key. She wrote the rules, I said. No. Patience looked at the guest book on the kitchen table. I wrote the rules. After Mother died and I became the keeper, I thought they were protective, that clear instructions could help guests navigate it safely. A pause. The book learned from the rules. It learned that rules kept people engaged, that following instructions was a kind of transaction, and every transaction deepened the mark. I made it better at hunting. I did not understand that until much later. Rule 6, I said. Confessing by writing in the book. That's the claiming. The moment you write your own words in the book, it has your handwriting. After that, it can write anything in your hand. Your disappearance, your return, whatever continues the feeding. She looked at me with clear, dark eyes in that paper face. That is why it will not let your pen mark the page. It is not ready for you yet. It wants you to want to write. It wants to feel like you chose it. I thought about the pencil test, about the page that accepted nothing. How many? I asked. She was quiet. 6,243. That is my count. I didn't say anything to that. 6,000 was not a number that fit naturally anywhere in my mind. The original ledger, I said. Behind the wall in the basement, the binding's terms can be rewritten. The diary says I believed that. I went down and tried. I became this. She raised one paper-thin hand. You touched it first. Before you wrote. The diary says it was warm and you touched it and it took something. Then you tried to write. She didn't answer directly. If someone went down there and wrote in the original ledger before letting it take anything, before hesitating, there is a chance the binding accepts new terms. 3 pillars hold it. Bloodline, land, hunger. Sever all 3 in writing and the binding dissolves. Every soul it has taken is released. And if it fails, you become the next entry. My watch said 9:22 p.m. I was about to ask her what words to use when the basement door slammed shut. Not slowly, not quietly. It hit the frame hard enough to rattle the hinges and send a vibration through the floorboards. The house groaned, a deep structural sound, like something in the foundation shifting. From below came a rattling, repetitive and insistent, like objects on shelves knocking against each other. Then more rattling, overlapping until it was constant and coming from everywhere under the floor at once. Patience stood very still in the lamplight. It knows we've been talking, she said quietly. The rattling slowed and stopped. The house settled back into silence. I checked my watch. 9:38 p.m. The lamp burned on. The sage smell was nearly gone. The guest book sat on the kitchen table with its cover closed, its pages refusing all ink, its spine still thick with the folded rules I had already broken. 2 hours and 22 minutes until midnight. The decision didn't take as long as it probably should have. I sat at the kitchen table for about 10 minutes after the rattling stopped, with the lamp burning in the other room and the guest book closed in front of me. I went through my options the way I'd go through sources before a story. What I knew, what I could verify, what I had to take on faith. What I knew. The guest book wouldn't accept my writing. The rules were a trap. Patience Holcomb had been in that basement in 1871 and never come back as herself. The futures I had read were fixed now. People who had no idea this property existed were going to come here, one after another, following the chain I had lengthened by reading their names. What I couldn't change, the phone signal, the ice on the road, the 17 futures already written. What I could possibly do, go downstairs before midnight and write 3 sentences in a book that might claim me the moment I opened it. I got up from the table. Patience had mentioned a utility closet beneath the basement stairs. I found the door to it just inside the basement doorway, on the right wall. I didn't go down yet. I stood at the top of the stairs and pulled the closet open and shone my phone's flashlight inside. The closet was narrow and deep, a bare bulb on a pull chain that didn't work when I tried it. Along the left wall, a snow shovel, a broom, a coil of rope on a hook. Along the back, a toolbox, a rusted bucket, a short-handled sledgehammer, and a flat pry bar leaned against the corner. The kind of tools that came with old properties, never moved, barely used, accumulating a layer of dust that made them look like they had always been there and always would be. I took the sledgehammer and the pry bar. Patience was beside me when I turned around. I hadn't heard her move. She was just there at the edge of my flashlight, her paper-textured skin catching the spillover light from the living room behind us. "The bricked section is on the north wall," she said. "The far end. You will know it because the mortar is different, newer than the rest of the foundation. My mother laid those bricks herself in 1847. Can you come down with me? I am bound to the property, not to any single floor of it." She paused. "I cannot hold things. My hands pass through most objects unless I concentrate very hard, and even then it does not last. I can direct you. That is the limit of what I can do." I started down the stairs. The basement was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November temperature outside. This cold was older, something that had been building in the enclosed space for a long time, damp and close. The stairs were wooden, and each step flexed slightly under my weight. 9 steps to the concrete floor. I swept the flashlight around the room. The shelves were the first thing I registered. They lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling, built from rough-cut lumber that had darkened with age. And on the shelves, books. Hundreds of them, each one sealed, some with wax, some with twine wrapped around the covers, some just closed but swollen at the edges as though the pages had expanded from the inside. They ranged from very old to nearly new. Some had cracked leather covers that looked 2 centuries old. Some had modern cloth bindings. One was a spiral notebook. Each had a small square of paper pasted to its spine with handwriting too small to read from where I was standing. I didn't count them. I didn't want to. The air smelled of old paper and something underneath it, something mineral and cold, like the inside of a well. My breath showed white in the flashlight beam. Patience moved ahead of me toward the far wall. I followed. The north wall was stone foundation, irregular granite blocks, field stone pulled from the earth when the land was first cleared, stacked and mortared with lime. But toward the far right corner, there was a section roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet high where the stones gave way to brick. Red brick, different in color and texture from everything around it. The mortar between the bricks was smoother than the original foundation work, more deliberate. Someone had taken their time here. "Behind that section," Patience said. She didn't say anything else. I set the pry bar down, gripped the sledgehammer with both hands, and looked at the brickwork for a moment. I picked a spot near the center where the mortar looked thinnest between 2 courses of brick, and I swung. The impact rang up through the handle and into my shoulders. The brick cracked but held. I swung again. The second hit opened a gap. Mortar dust fell. I kept swinging, working the same spot, until a brick shifted inward and dropped into the cavity behind the wall. I crouched down and put my flashlight to the gap and looked through. Dark. Shallow. The cavity was maybe 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. I could see the back of it, more fieldstone, and in the forward part of the space, below the gap I had made, I could see the corner of a wooden box. I stood up and kept swinging. It took longer than I expected. Some bricks came loose easily, the mortar crumbling from a century and a half of slow deterioration. Others held stubbornly, and I had to work the pry bar behind them after the sledgehammer cracked the mortar loose. My shoulders were burning and I was sweating in the cold air by the time I had an opening roughly 2 feet across and 18 inches high. My watch said 10:47 p.m. when I finally crouched down to look into the full cavity. The box was there, wooden, about the size of a shoebox, held together with iron fittings that had gone a deep rust brown. In front of the box, laid on the cavity floor with its feet toward me, was a child's skeleton. Not scattered, not haphazard, arranged. The small bones of the arms were crossed over the chest in the way you folded a body for burial. The skull had been turned to face the box. Someone had done this with intention, with care, and that was the thing that hit me harder than anything else in that basement. Not the bones themselves. The care. A mother who had done an unforgivable thing and then arranged the evidence of it as tenderly as she could, as though tenderness at the end could balance what came before. I didn't say anything. Patience didn't either. The silence in the basement was complete. I reached into the cavity, working around the bones without disturbing them, and lifted the box out. I set it on the concrete floor beside me and unlatched the iron catch on the lid. The original ledger was smaller than the guest book upstairs, maybe 8 inches by 5, thin, fewer than 100 pages by the look of it. The leather cover was blackened and cracked, split along the spine in 2 places. The surface of the binding had been carved with letters that weren't quite standard, the letter forms familiar enough to recognize as letters but slightly off from what I was used to, the angles wrong in a way that made them hard to read at a glance. And the ledger was warm, not ambient temperature warm, warm the way skin is warm. The specific heat of something alive, something metabolic. I could feel it from 4 inches away before I had touched anything. I held my palm over it and the warmth pressed back like a breath. I did not touch it. "The 3 pillars," I said. I kept my eyes on the ledger. "Tell me the exact shape of what I need to write." "The bloodline anchor first. The Holcomb bloodline is the root of the binding. Constance created it, and I am the last of her line still tethered to it. Release me by name. State that the obligation is severed." Her voice was steady. "The land anchor second. The binding is tied to this property, to this ground. State that the ledger holds no claim on any place. Then the hunger last, the ledger's capacity to write futures. Revoke it." And I write without stopping, without letting it find a space between words. Patience touched it before she was ready, and it entered through the hesitation. I heard something shift in her voice on her own name. Not pain exactly, but the particular flatness of someone saying a hard thing they have said many times. "Do not stop writing once you begin. Do not lift the pen. Do not let there be silence between one sentence and the next." I pulled the pen from my jacket. Same pen that had marked my palm an hour ago and left no trace on the guest book's pages. I held it and looked at the warm ledger in its open box and thought about Patience in 1871 going down here alone, touching it, feeling it take something before she even started. I picked the ledger up, opened it to the first blank page I could find, touched the pen to the paper, and wrote. The ink went down clean, dark and immediate, no resistance, exactly the way paper is supposed to accept ink. I wrote the first pillar without lifting the pen. Patience. Holcomb is released from all obligations to this binding. Her soul is free. The bloodline anchor is severed. Patience made a sound I had no name for. Not pain, not grief. Something that had been compressed for 150 years, releasing all at once, like pressure equalizing. I didn't look back at her. I kept the pen on the page. The house above me shifted. A sound traveled down through the walls, deep, structural, the kind of groan that comes from a load-bearing element adjusting under a force it wasn't built for. Dust fell from the ceiling joists and settled on my shoulders. I wrote the second pillar without pausing. This ledger is no longer bound to the Holcomb property or any land. The land anchor is dissolved. The house screamed. I don't have a better word for it. The sound started somewhere in the walls and immediately became the whole room, a frequency I felt in my back teeth, in my sternum. The shelves on 3 walls lurched outward simultaneously. Books cascaded from the upper rows first, then the lower ones, hitting the concrete floor hard, some splitting open, some staying sealed and rolling. The shelves themselves followed, crashing forward, filling the basement with the sound of splintering lumber and the smell of old paper released all at once, a smell like every library that had ever existed exhaling at the same time. I pressed the ledger flat against the floor with my left hand and kept writing. The pen shook. The words went down anyway. This ledger shall no longer write futures into existence. The hunger is ended. All claimed souls are released to rest. The darkness came out of the broken wall. It moved slowly at first, finding the floor, finding the low spaces. It wasn't fog. I could see the shapes in it before it reached me, and I understood what I was looking at, even though I didn't want to. Faces, hands reaching forward, mouths moving with no sound coming out. 6,000 people pressed into whatever space the ledger had kept them in, all of them moving toward the opening, all of them trying to get through at once. It reached me, cold, but not the cold of temperature, the cold of absence, of something that had been held too long in a place without light or air. It moved around me and through me, and I held still and let it go. The mouths were close. I saw dozens of faces clearly, and not one of them was looking at me. Every one of them was looking past me at something I couldn't see, something that wasn't in the basement at all, something that was somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere that had been waiting for them for a very long time. The darkness thinned. The faces became less distinct. The hands pulled back. The cold receded. The smell of old paper faded to nothing. The overturned shelves and scattered books remained, but the spaces between them were just ordinary dark now. The ordinary dark of a basement in an old farmhouse on a November night in Vermont. The ledger in my hands was cold, the same temperature as the floor, the same temperature as the air. Something that had been warm since 1847 had gone quiet. I sat back on my heels and breathed for a moment. Patience was near the stairs. She looked different. More solid. Not fully physical, but more present. Less like a transparency, and more like a person standing in a dim room. The paper quality of her skin had softened. She was looking at her own hands, pressing her fingertips together, testing them the way you test a surface you aren't sure about. "It worked," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Seems like it. I can feel the absence of it." She looked up at me. "I carried it so long I stopped noticing it as weight. It was just what I was." Something moved across her face that was different from anything I had seen there before. Lighter, simpler. "Thank you, Daniel." I looked at my watch. 11:58 p.m. I was still in the basement of the Holcomb farmhouse with 2 minutes until midnight, surrounded by overturned shelves and scattered books and the bones of a 7-year-old boy laid carefully in an open cavity in the north wall. I picked up the original ledger and the pry bar, and I went for the stairs. I came up the basement stairs at 11:59 p.m. I know that because I looked at my watch on the second step and on the fourth step, and at the top, 3 separate checks the way you check a stove you're not sure you turned off. I had the original ledger under my left arm, the pry bar still in my right hand from some instinct I didn't stop to examine, and I crossed the living room in maybe 4 steps and grabbed my coat off the hook in the entryway without slowing down. The hurricane lamp was still burning on the mantel. The photograph of Patience Holcomb was still in its frame. Her eyes were aimed slightly past the camera, at something off to the left, the way they had been in the beginning, the way they were supposed to be. I went out through the front door. The cold outside was a different kind of cold than the basement. Clean, moving, the way November air in Vermont moves even when there isn't much wind. Something in it that felt alive compared to what I had been breathing for the past 2 hours. I stood on the porch for a moment and breathed it. The green mountains were black shapes against a sky with more stars than I usually remembered being there. The field was dark and quiet. The stone wall at its eastern edge was a gray line I could just barely make out. My watch clicked over to midnight while I stood there. Nothing happened. No sound from the house, no movement behind the windows. The darkness inside was just darkness. I walked to my truck and got in. The dirt road down to Route 100 took 8 minutes at the speed I was willing to drive in the dark with my hands still not entirely steady. I came out onto the paved road and turned south toward Rochester, and I had cell signal before I even reached the village. 2 bars, then 3. I pulled into the parking lot of the first lit building I could find, a closed gas station with a security light over the pump island, and sat in the truck with the engine running and the original ledger on the passenger seat. I called the Vermont State Police at 12:22 a.m. I told the dispatcher that I had been staying at a rental property off Holcomb Road north of Rochester, and that I believed the property had been the site of multiple disappearances. I gave the address. I said I had found what I believed to be human remains in the basement, a child's bones in a sealed cavity in the foundation wall. I did not mention the ledger. I did not mention Patience Holcomb or the guest book or any of what had happened between sunset and midnight. There was no version of that conversation that ended with anyone taking me seriously. The trooper who called me back 20 minutes later took down my information and said someone would go out to the property. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone trying to decide if the person they were talking to was credible or unwell. I answered his questions directly and without elaboration. I had been staying there. I had broken through a section of the basement wall with tools I found on the property. I had found the bones. I had left the property and called immediately. He said they'd be in touch. I drove to a motel in Rochester that had a vacancy sign lit, checked in, and slept for 11 hours. The investigation that followed was slow and complicated, and not something I participated in directly. The state police went out the next day and found the basement the way I had left it. Shelves overturned, books scattered, the bricked-up cavity open. They found Thomas Holcomb's bones. The property was flagged as a potential historic crime scene. The Airbnb listing came down within 48 hours, I assumed at the state's request. The owner, a real estate trust that had acquired the property at auction years earlier and apparently never visited it, was contacted, and the property was condemned pending the investigation. In the meantime, I went home to Burlington and started working. I had read 17 names in that guest book, 17 futures I had fixed by witnessing them. The binding was severed now, Patience had told me that, and without the binding, those entries in the guest book were just words on a page. They weren't instructions anymore. They weren't roads the ledger could force people to walk. But they had been real people I had read about, and the futures I had read for them were gone. But the people weren't. They still existed. They still deserved to know. Jennifer Park was the first name after Marcus Webb's. I found her through her byline. She wrote for a Boston magazine, mostly long-form features about regional culture. I called her, and when she didn't answer, I sent a message through her publication's contact form and then through her professional email, explaining that I was a journalist who had stayed at the Holcomb property, that I had concerns about the property and about a previous guest named Marcus Webb, and asking her to call me. She called me the next morning. She had been planning to stay there. She told me she had heard about the property from a colleague and had it on her list of places to research for a piece she was working on about abandoned hill farms in central Vermont. She hadn't booked yet. I told her not to, and I told her about Marcus Webb, that he had left a note describing something he'd found in the basement and had stopped being reachable afterward. I suggested she look into the missing persons reports connected to the address. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said she was going to make some calls. Within 2 weeks, she had found 6 open missing persons cases connected to the property stretching back 11 years. Marcus Webb was not among them, which meant he might have gotten out the way I had, or might simply not have been reported yet. I passed what I had to her and to the state police investigator assigned to the case, and I left it to them to follow the threads I didn't have the credentials to follow legally. I found Margaret Willard through the Vermont Folk Life Center in Middlebury. I was looking for anyone with documented knowledge of folk magic traditions in central Vermont, cunning work specifically, the term patience had used, and a researcher there mentioned Margaret as someone who had been interviewed for their oral history archive. She was 83 years old, living on a farm outside Randolph, and she was still there. I drove out to see her on a Wednesday afternoon in early December, with the original ledger wrapped in a cloth bag on the passenger seat. The farm was down a road that made Holcomb Road feel like a highway. Unpaved, ungraveled, 2 ruts with grass growing between them. The farmhouse was small and well-maintained, wood smoke coming from the chimney, a vegetable garden in the side yard put to bed for winter under a layer of straw. Margaret Willard answered the door before I knocked. She was small and sharp-eyed, wearing a flannel shirt and work pants, her white hair cut close. She looked at me and then at the bag under my arm and said, "You'd better come in." She made tea, and we sat at her kitchen table, and I put the ledger on the table between us. She looked at it without touching it for a long moment, then reached out and laid one hand flat on the cover and held it there, and I watched her face. "The binding's cut," she said. "Whatever this was, it isn't anymore. But the book still holds something." She lifted her hand and looked at it, then at me. "You rewrote the terms?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they find out something they already suspected. "There's a tradition that comes out of the same root as what made this thing. Old practice, comes partly from what the hill women here learned from the Abenaki, partly from what they brought from across the water." She turned the ledger over and looked at the carved letters on the cover. "The souls are free, but the books are still containers. You can burn a container after you've emptied it, but you want to do it right, on the longest night, when the passage is clearest." "The winter solstice," I said. "December 21st. She set the ledger back on the table. "Bring them all. Every book that was part of it." I went back to the Holcomb property twice with the state police investigator's knowledge and a formal request to access the basement for historical documentation purposes. The cover that let me remove the books was that I was cataloging them for a research piece, which was close enough to true. I loaded them into the back of my truck in cardboard boxes. There were more than I had estimated in the dark, 311 sealed volumes, plus the guest book from the mantel upstairs, plus the original ledger. Each sealed book had its small spine label in handwriting too small to read without a magnifying glass. I used one in the truck on the drive home and stopped after the second label. The names were still legible. I didn't need to read any more of them. December 21st was a clear night, cold in the way Vermont gets cold in the 3rd week of December. Settled, total, the kind of cold that has been there long enough to own the air. I loaded the boxes into the truck and drove down to Randolph. Margaret had a fire already burning when I arrived, built in a stone ring in the side field away from the barn, using split applewood. The fire was low and steady. She had set out bundles of dried sage on the ground nearby, and a small clay bowl with something in it I didn't ask about. We carried the boxes out together, one at a time. When they were all stacked near the fire ring, Margaret stood at the edge of the firelight and began to speak. The language was Abenaki. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the quality of them. They were old in a way that had nothing to do with how long Margaret had known them. They felt like they came from the ground, from the specific ground of these hills, from a time before the farms and before the cunning work, and before Constance Holcomb bound anything to anything. Margaret spoke quietly and without performance. Her eyes were closed. I started moving the books into the fire. They burned slowly at first. The sealed ones resisted the way old leather resists, curling before it catches. I kept feeding them in steadily, one after another, the way you feed a wood stove on a cold night. The smoke that came off them was thick and had a smell I didn't expect. Old libraries. But also something else. Something that wasn't paper or leather or old ink. Something that smelled like a long-held breath finally released. Like grief. But grief that had finally been allowed to finish. Margaret's words kept going. I didn't stop to watch or listen too long. I just kept moving the books from the boxes to the fire, one at a time, in order. When the last one was in, the original ledger, which I saved for last, Margaret went quiet. The fire burned on for another hour or so, working down through everything in the ring. Neither of us spoke much. At some point, Margaret went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee, and we stood there in the cold and drank them and watched the fire drop into coals. "It's done," she said finally. "Whatever was in those books has moved on. The land will heal." She looked at the coals for a moment. "The boy's bones should go in the ground properly. The Rochester Cemetery would be right for it. He belongs near the land he was part of." I made the calls to arrange that in January. The state archaeologist was involved, which made it slow, but Thomas Holcomb's bones were interred in the Rochester Cemetery the following spring, in a small plot with a plain granite marker. The marker had his name and his years, 1840 to 1847, and nothing else, because there was nothing else I could put there that would have been adequate. The Hill Farms article came out in February. It did reasonably well for a piece about agricultural decline in a state with a small readership. My editor called it quietly devastating, which was the kind of note you got when a story worked, but no one knew quite what to do with it. The second piece I wrote over the course of that same winter, nights mostly, when I couldn't sleep. It was longer than anything I had ever written for publication. It had everything in it. The ledger, the rules, the guest book, Marcus Webb's warning, the names in the future entries, Patience Holcomb and her diary, and her paper-thin skin, and the handwriting on her teeth. Thomas in the wall. 6,243 people pressed into the dark, the way the pen had moved across the original ledger's pages and the ink had gone down clean. I finished it in March and read it through once and then locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Some stories aren't meant to be published. They're meant to be kept. Written down so they're real, so they can't be undone, so there's a record somewhere that says, "This happened, a person witnessed it, and the person did not look away." I still have the drawer key on my keychain. I check it sometimes the way I checked my watch going up those basement stairs. Not because I think anything will happen, just because some habits, once you develop them, are harder to break than the things that made them necessary. Some books don't record history, they create it, and sometimes if you're brave enough to pick up the pen yourself, you can write an ending that sets everyone free.